Chapter 24. Weddings and Births. After our return from holiday in Germany, there was a wedding to prepare for. By this time, Mum was glad that I was getting married, even though she was not at all sure that John was the right man for me. I knew this, of course, but also knew that what she wanted for me was not necessarily what I wanted for myself. The past few months had been stressful for her. John and I often stayed out until the small hours. Mum worried, and if I impatiently told her that we had just been sitting outside in the car talking, which was often the case, it didn't stop her losing a lot of sleep over her daughter being out so late. If I had my own place like most girls my age have these days, you wouldn't know how late I was staying out and wouldn't be worried, I grumbled. But for Mum, that was not the point. Our wedding was to take place at the end of August 1969. I asked Hans Werner to be my witness. None of us wanted Wilfred there, and I didn't even tell my father that I was getting married. But I was persuaded to invite Grandma Green. Sonia offered to make me a dress if we bought the material and found a pattern. We chose a heavy pale blue Swiss embroidered cotton and silk lining for my mini dress and jacket, which even now, 40 years later, still hangs in the spare room wardrobe wrapped in plastic bags. Although a more romantic dress would have been lovely, this was the 60s, and minis and bright colours were the more fashionable option unless you went for the full-on church wedding, which as atheists we couldn't contemplate. I bought a plain pair of low-heeled court shoes and a simple handbag, both of which I dyed apricot pink to match the apricot-coloured velvet rose that I wore on my jacket. Mum was already excited at the prospect of Hans Werner moving into the flat soon after I moved out. For me, too, this was satisfactory, as I no longer needed to worry that I was leaving Mum and Miranda with financial difficulties. John had recently taken over the hairdressing salon in Cricklewood Broadway on the Edgware Road called Potter's Hair Fashions. The previous owner, Eric Potter, had been in the business all his life, as had his father, but now he wanted to retire. The contract allowed Potter to retain an interest in the business as a consultant for the first 5 years to give us the benefit of his experience, as running a business was new to John. The salon had a flat on the top floor of the 3-story building. It was a neglected, run-down sort of place. There was only one lavatory in the whole building, so whoever lived in the flat had to share the loo used by all the clients and staff. There was no bathroom, just a bath in the kitchen, with a cover for when it was not in use. But it was somewhere for us to live, and was only about half a mile from Mum's flat. Because he was new to running his own business and a little unsure of himself, John fell in with Mr. Potter's advice. "You can't take a whole Saturday off to get married, boy. You have clients who depend on you and a business to run." So John worked in the morning until it was time to go to the registry office and booked more clients in for the afternoon after an extended lunch. It was late morning when our small party arrived at Hampstead Registry Office. Miranda and Mum, John's mother Vi, Grandma Green, my cousin Paul, Sonia, Hans Werner, and Wilfred. He hadn't been invited, but Grandma must have told him, and obviously he thought he had the right to be there. It certainly spoilt the day for Ruth and Miranda, and caused me considerable embarrassment. It probably embarrassed Hans Werner too, as he had been given the task usually reserved for a father as my witness, for as far as I recall, there was no giving away at the registry office. I remember that Vi, who had never met my father, asked John who the old man was. She assumed he was Grandma's husband. After the ceremony and photographs on the registry office steps, John and I went out to lunch alone at an exclusive fish restaurant in Golders Green, and the rest of the party went back to Mum's flat, where I joined them after John returned to the salon. We spent the afternoon getting some nibbles together for an evening party. Such a romantic wedding. Just as John and I had to get used to life as a couple, so the three who lived in the West Hampstead flat had to settle into their new lives. Miranda was busy working for a music publisher in the West End during the day and playing violin in various amateur orchestras and chamber groups in the evening. She also enrolled for 2 evening classes, statistics and violin making, so she was out practically every night, leaving Mum and Hans Werner alone. In the evenings they read, listened to classical music, played Scrabble or cards, and went out to the theatre, opera or concerts. Hans Werner brought many German books with him when he moved in, and Mum enjoyed rediscovering the pleasure of reading in her mother tongue. It was a long-forgotten and much-treasured experience to be able to have conversations in their own language when they were alone together. She always said that there were some things that she found easier to say in German. Hans Werner liked coming home from work each evening to home-cooked food, and Mum really enjoyed preparing meals to share with him. He must also have appreciated having more space than the tiny bed-sitter in Golders Green, which he had lived in since the end of the war. One thing puzzles me. For many years Mum had suffered from asthma, and yet Hans Werner's smoking habit didn't seem to bother her that much. I think that anything he did was all right with her at the time. She was so happy that they were together at last. They started taking holidays together in Italy. Hans Werner knew Italy well, having travelled there on his own many times, but before their holidays he still did weeks of study on the history of all the architectural, sculptural and painted treasures he wanted to go to see. He was the perfect companion and guide for my mother, who soaked up the culture and appreciated the detailed knowledge he passed on during their tourist forays into Renaissance Italy. For the first time in her life, Mum experienced air travel. I had at this time never flown myself and felt sick with anxiety that my beloved mother should do something that I imagined to be so dangerous. I was so sure I would never see her again, that the plane would crash. It seems extraordinary now, ridiculous even, but when I said goodbye to her and wished her a happy holiday, I was nearly in tears. But Mum was full of anticipation and excitement. When she got home after her first holiday, she said, "Ah, Chrissy, flying above the clouds is one of the most wonderful things I've ever done. You must fly. I couldn't take my eyes from the window. I can't wait to do it again." I have photos of her on those Italian holidays, wearing a sun hat and smiling at the camera, in Florence, Venice, Rome, Pompeii, and on Capri, all places she had never dreamed she would visit, and pictures of Hans Werner sitting in the sun, relaxing with a bottle of local wine and a cigarette, studying guidebooks, or beaming up at the camera from a gondola with a mischievous grin on his face. John and I were very busy learning to run the salon, employing people, doing the books and wages, and at the same time getting settled into married life. Because my mother was such a good cook, I had never wanted to interfere in the kitchen. I had never done any cooking other than those hated cookery classes at school, where we made tasteless grey potato soup and Victoria sponges that sunk so badly in the middle that they had the texture of a thick undercooked pancake. With the help of a book called Easy Stages Cookery, I was teaching myself the basics, and was often grateful to Birdseye for their ready meals whenever I ran out of ideas. I always made an effort whenever friends came round to dinner, however, and gradually, as my confidence in my ability grew, the horrible ready meals appeared less often at our table. During our second year of marriage, John became very ill with tuberculosis. To make matters worse, he turned out to be allergic to all the usual TB drugs. It was only after a long stay in hospital, during which he had constant trials with all the available drugs, that they eventually found a recently developed one that he could take. For weeks I ran the salon. I was not a hairdresser and not used to running a business. I'd be in the salon all day long dealing with difficult clients who were more worried about their hair not getting done than the fact that my husband was seriously ill. The staff, too, took advantage of my lack of hairdressing knowledge and business experience. After the salon closed for the day, I'd take a train to visit John in the isolation ward of the hospital and try to cheer him up, for he was suffering with acute depression at his condition. Then, when at last I got home, exhausted and hungry, I would pop into the fish and chip shop next door to the salon for a takeaway. Although Mum wanted me to go to them for supper, I seldom did, except at weekends, as it was all I could do to get through each day and be ready for the next. As always when under stress, I put on a lot of weight that year. I suppose it's because I was so involved with my own worries that I remember so very little of what Mum was doing at that time, although she must have been very anxious for us and probably came and helped sometimes in the salon. I don't remember. Miranda says that although she was living with them, she had such a busy social life that she wasn't very aware of what was going on in Mum and Hans Werner's lives, and my problems too were peripheral to Miranda's life. She remembers very little about that time. Young people are understandably mainly interested in their own activities, relationships and concerns. I knew that Mum was contented in her own way, however, and happy times are invariably less dramatic than bad times, and therefore don't register so clearly in the memory. I was the one with the problems, and my only concerns were to get my husband well and home again, and to know whether or not it was safe for me to kiss him. Tuberculosis is such a frightening and highly infectious disease. Everything changed for the better in 1972. John was getting well again, clear of infectiousness, and coming to the end of his time on drugs for his TB. And we were expecting our first baby. Miranda, sick of working in an office, had decided that she wanted to go away to college in Newark, Nottinghamshire, to do a 3-year full-time course of violin making. She, with her usual sensible planning, had saved up to buy herself a caravan and a moped in order to live more cheaply while she was a student. Perhaps it was the prospect of them living alone in the flat without Miranda as a chaperone that made Hans Werner once more propose marriage to Ruth. After her first disappointment, she must have been wary. I seem to remember that she asked me what I thought about it. Much as I loved him, I still felt I couldn't trust him not to back out again. I think I may have said something to that effect, either to him or to Mum. The truth was that I suffered from such terrible nausea right through that pregnancy that I could barely think of anything except how badly I was feeling. But I know I was worried for them, especially for Mum. I felt that as they had had no physical relationship, I believe I asked Mum directly about this. After all, we were now living in a permissive society where such things were almost taken for granted. It might be better to wait until their relationship had progressed in that direction. Mum brushed off my fears. Hans Werner comes from a generation and class of people who didn't do that kind of thing outside marriage, she assured me with confidence. So they went ahead, and my worries about Hans Werner backing out this time were unfounded. 2.5 years after John and I got married at Hampstead Registry Office, on a cold day in March 1972, we were back there again for Mum and Hans Werner's marriage ceremony. Again, it was a small party, attended by the ever-present Sonia, whose loyalty to my father in former times seems to have switched to Hans Werner, and by Hans Werner's friend, Heinz Westfried, who had originally introduced them, and who came over from Germany to witness this extraordinary event. Arthur, a German friend from Hans Werner's time in the British Army, came with his wife, Helma, and Miranda, John and I were also present. So Mum married the love of her life and changed her name again, not to Kastner, his German surname, but to Eames, the name Hans Werner had chosen when he became a British citizen. I felt a warm glow at the romantic story of these two dear people getting together after their long history of loss and friendship. After the ceremony and signing of the register, we all took taxis to the Spaghetti House in Soho to celebrate. All I can remember of the occasion is the horrible sickness that overwhelmed me as soon as I smelt the food, and of course I could only allow myself a small sip of champagne to toast them and wish them happiness together. If I still had any reservations about this marriage, I kept them to myself. Mum was deeply, deeply happy and full of excited optimism for their future. It shone from her face all of that day, and it shines still in the photographs we took. How Hans Werner felt I can hardly say. He looked happy. He was never a man to talk about feelings, probably a legacy from his family's dreadful fate at the hands of the Nazis. He seemed contented enough with the occasion, and not too scared of at last getting married at the age of 59, or of inheriting 2 grown-up daughters and a son-in-law in the process. I'm sure he was quite happy to belong at last, to be part of our little family, and to know that he was loved by us all. 4 months later, Mum and Hans Werner were able to celebrate becoming Granny and Grosspapa to our new baby daughter Jane. If I remember little about the process of becoming a mother myself, thinking about Mum brings some of it back to me as I hear her reminding me. You tell me you can't recall any of it, Chrissy. Listen, I'll remind you. First, that terrible labour. Remember now? Ach, ja, you did not mention that. Well, I remember it. I'll never forget. Of course, you won't remember most of it, because you were in pain and on gas and air. I sat there by your bed for a long, long time, willing and willing for that baby to come quickly, listening to you saying things, ranting. I'll never repeat them to you, never. You were crazed, crazy with pain and gas. I thought I'd lose you, my crystal. Ach, I was so scared. I aged years in those 3 days. Then at last they decided to take you away for a general anesthetic. It was about time. When I first saw Jane, with her head so long, so misshapen, I thought she might be brain damaged from such a long labour. Her head was all thin and strange. I felt so sorry for you both. All that struggling, and then perhaps a damaged baby. I couldn't believe it when John took one look at her and said, "Oh, isn't she beautiful?" Of course, I changed my mind a few days later when her head started to look a bit more normal. You were still woozy with drugs until the next day, quite unaware you had a baby daughter. I think you had gone through so much pain you hardly cared any more, one way or another, until you saw her, of course. Then it was different. By the time you came round properly, they had been giving you drugs to dry up your milk. I remember you telling me that you asked them when you could start feeding your baby. Jane was already using a bottle and you had no milk. It was disgraceful. Do you remember those little blonde curls she had after a year of hardly any hair at all? People said she looked like Princess Anne when she was little. Do you still have that picture of her in the cornfield, in her red and white dress printed with clowns? Assailed by an almost painful intensity of love for my new baby daughter, I said to Mum, I had no idea. Now I know for the first time how much I really mean to you. Why didn't you ever say? Mum's face broke into a smile, and I knew that of course she had said it, had told me over and over again, with every song sung, every meal cooked, and every moment when the moon and stars shone down on our enraptured, upturned faces. Her gentle heart invisibly tied to me through every one of the 29 years since I myself was born. She sat at her kitchen table, stitching white embroidery thread into soft yellow fabric. She practised again all of the old half-forgotten skills of sewing and smocking that she had once used for her own little girls, creating a tiny dress for her baby granddaughter. She could see that those new Baby Grow all-in-ones for babies were very practical, but she longed to see Jane in a pretty dress for a change. By next Saturday, this first dress would be finished. On Saturdays, I still helped John in the business with reception duties and shampooing when we were short-staffed. Early on Saturday mornings, I walked over to Mum's for breakfast, with Jane tucked into her pram. As soon as the door opened, I'd be greeted with the wonderful fragrance of bread rolls warming in the oven and freshly brewed coffee. The table was laid with dishes of continental sausage and hams, continental cheeses, and jars of jam and honey. Breakfast with Mum and Hans Werner was my special indulgence before the busy day ahead. Leaving Jane to be cared for by her granny for the day, I'd walk back to the salon before the first clients of the day were finished and ready to pay their bills. Mum relished these Saturdays when she had Jane to herself, and a close relationship grew up between granny and granddaughter over those first years that would remain a constant to both throughout Mum's life. After the salon closed at the end of the day, John and I went over to West Hampstead to fetch our baby, sometimes staying there for supper and a game of Scrabble or cards. It's remarkable how quickly time goes by when everything is going well. I recall little of those months other than the happy hours of looking after our baby daughter and sharing the joy of her progress with her doting granny. Of course, it was hard work, all babies are, and there were plenty of down days, but still it seemed to be the most rewarding job in the world. Hans Werner, Großpapa to baby Jane, also seemed charmed by his little granddaughter, although he had little experience of children. It must have been quite extraordinary for him to suddenly be part of an extended family after so many years on his own. The entrance to our flat was through the front door of the salon, and the clients took a great interest in our baby as I came in and out of the building, often remarking that it was a shame that a hairdresser's daughter should have so little hair. It was when Jane was 15 months old, and toddling rather faster than any of us realised she could, that an accident occurred that shook us all and put Jane in hospital for 3 weeks. Mum felt dreadful about what happened, because it was on a Saturday when she was looking after Jane. She was preparing her bottle of milk, heating it in a jug of hot water, when Jane ran up behind her without her noticing, and in an instant pulled the scalding water over herself. I'll never forget that phone call with Mum, distraught, and Jane screaming in the background. It is what every parent dreads. Then the screaming subsided to a desperate, "Mum! Mum! Mum! Chrissy, come quickly, it's Jane. An accident?" "What happened?" Oh, we'll be there. John, come quickly, it's Jane." John and I dropped everything and rushed over in the car. Jane was taken to Great Ormond Street Hospital. She was badly scalded on her neck and under her chin and on the top of her arm. Because she was so little and the wounds so close together, her head had to be bandaged and tied to the top end of the cot, and her wrists and ankles bound and tied to the side bars of the cot. This was to stretch her body so that the wounds didn't touch each other and grow together. It looked like a horrible parody of a crucifixion on that little bed. In those days, Great Ormond Street didn't have facilities for parents to stay with their children, so every evening I had to leave her, and every evening it broke my heart to see her distress. I tried my best not to cry in front of my baby. I didn't want to upset her further. When John came and saw her stretched out like that and in pain, he turned away to hide his tears. For Mum, the wait was agonizing. "There was the accident. How could I have let that happen? Jane just ran up behind me on her chubby little legs. I had no idea she would come so fast. So long to wait, so much guilt, and waiting before I could see her again. Only you and John were allowed in the hospital. How much I cried when you weren't there. We all cried. I can't tell you how relieved I was afterwards that you still trusted me with her. Of course, you knew how utterly upset I was, how much I loved her. I was so involved and emotionally drained that I don't remember if I gave a lot of time to thinking how Mum felt. I'm sure I must have done. I knew how upset she was and how guilty she was feeling. She might have been afraid that I wouldn't trust her to look after Jane again, but of course I knew that it was an accident and that it was really important for Jane and her granny to be together again as soon as it was possible. If I felt terrible every time I saw the scars, I knew that Mum must have felt even worse. For a long time those scars looked red and raw, and they took years to fade to the hardly discernible marks on her flesh that they are today. When she was a teenager, and of course very aware of her appearance, I asked her if any of her friends ever noticed. She shrugged. Sometimes. What do you say? Just that I got scolded when I was a baby. Does it worry you that they notice? No, why should it? And I really believe it didn't bother her that much. All in all, I think we must have handled her injuries quite sensibly, because she was always so matter-of-fact and dismissive about them, even though it was a seriously traumatic event for all of us at the time. But apart from Jane's accident, those were good times. We used to take Sunday walks on Hampstead Heath or in Golders Hill Park. We'd go up to the bandstand and have coffee or ice creams under the ginkgo trees, and Jane would run off on her chubby little legs to feed the ducks on the pond. We never knew who we might see up there. Lots of famous people lived in Hampstead. There were the fish suppers at a wonderful fish and chip restaurant in West End Lane, where the local Jewish people liked to eat, and it was sometimes hard to get a table. Life was good. Then I got pregnant again. I was so afraid after my first awful experience that we both decided I should go privately this time. I had no health insurance and couldn't really afford it, but I went to a gynecologist in Harley Street. It cost us a small fortune, but I was very direct with him. I asked if I could pay for each visit, plus a little extra each time, rather than have a big bill at the end. He was very willing to do it that way. When it got close to the time the baby was due, Mum said she'd have Jane for a few days so that I could rest. She could hardly credit it when she got a phone call from me. "Mum, I've had the baby. You have a little grandson." She didn't believe me. "Ach, Bo, I didn't know you were even in labour." I told her that when I went to Harley Street on the previous day, the doctor had thought it was time, so this morning I'd gone into the clinic to be induced. I was so happy because they gave me an epidural and I didn't have any pain this time. "But John didn't let me know." I told her I'd made him promise not to tell so that she wouldn't worry. David's birth in a private clinic in St. John's Wood was such a different experience for me than Jane's difficult birth. I often wonder if it was my long labour that made Jane such a fighter, and my easy one that made David so laid back. Perhaps. It was a good thing to have a boy, one of each. I think John was a bit stunned. He had been sure it would be another girl. One day I said to Mum, "Mum, I've never looked after a boy. I feel a bit... what do I do?" I soon learned. It's funny I didn't feel like that with Jane. Being female myself, I suppose. Babies are babies. Girl, boy, it's just the same either way.